Good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Robin Axel Adams. I'm the program manager at the Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics. Welcome. I just would like to make sure that you have signed in at the table out here. This is how you will receive your continuing education. So please make sure you sign in. If you're at one of our lecture sites, please make sure, or our broadcast sites, please make sure you've signed in with them. Today's lecture, we are focusing today on humanism in medicine. It is our second annual, maybe our third annual, Meg Gaffney Lecture on Humanism. We started this lecture about 2 years ago when Dr. Gaffney retired to honor her and her outstanding work as professor and ethicist, mentor, and the significant contribution that she made to the ethics community. Our lecture today is being recorded and broadcasted, so if you have questions at the end, please make sure that you get the microphone, not just for this audience, but for the audiences that we have out there. And the audiences that we have out there are Arnett, IU Health Ball Memorial, IU Health Blackford, North, and West, the Child Life and Creative Arts Therapies Department at Peyton Manning Children's Hospital at St. Vincent's. And we would like to welcome our viewers at Reed Health Hospital. Another reminder to silence all of your electronic devices, and if you need to take a call, to please leave the auditorium to do that. And I need to say that our speaker today has no financial conflicts of interest to disclose. So now with all of those official things, let me have the pleasure to introduce to you Emily Beckman. Dr. Beckman is the Director and Assistant Professor of Medical Humanities and Health Studies at the IU School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. She's also an Adjunct Assistant Professor of Medicine at the Indiana University School of Medicine, and she completed her Ethics Fellowship with us at the Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics in 2010. In addition to her responsibilities at the School of Liberal Arts, Dr. Beckman continues to devote teaching time each year to teach narrative medicine to fourth-year medical students. Her research focuses largely on hope at the end of life, empathy in medical education, narrative, and most recently, an interdisciplinary approach to understanding the history and representation of mental health and illness in Indiana's former Central State Hospital. So it is exciting and a pleasure to welcome Emily. Thanks, Emily.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to forget to, there we go. I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much, Robin. I thought this is one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm going to try to watch the clock closely, but sometimes I get carried away, so if I'm going over time, just start waving or something. This is the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You may or may not have known that. To celebrate, I thought that we might, to celebrate 200 years, I thought that we might quickly go through 200 tips from Mary Shelley on how to be better healthcare professionals. It shouldn't take too long. No, I'm kidding. I condensed it down to 10, but truly I had about 200 to begin with. So you can feel fortunate that it's only 10. So Frankenstein at the bedside, a lesson in better care. This might have prompted some imagery in your head. I hope it did, probably of something green and grotesque, right? Standing over a patient in the hospital, maybe connected to tubes or wires or machines or that kind of thing. Because we often think of Frankenstein, of course, as something green and grotesque. But I hope by the end of this talk, you will realize that that's not necessarily the case. And I hope that we'll be thinking about Frankenstein much differently by 1 o'clock. Okay, so quickly, the objectives that I provided before this talk, we're going to try to hit all of them today. I'm going to begin with a quick, brief definition of medical humanities. I'd be happy to talk more about that with you later if you are interested. I'm going to try to articulate the value of literature in medical education, nursing education, any kind of health professional education. And then finally, to pick out some of the specific lessons within Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that might help us be better caregivers. So bear with me as we move through those. So first on the agenda, what is medical humanities? How many of you have heard the term medical humanities before? Ah, right. So maybe roughly 40%. That's great. So medical humanities, my favorite article about the definition is written by Rafael Campo, and it's called Medical Humanities, for lack of a better term. And I think that it's appropriate. It's difficult to define briefly, but it's an endeavor that emphasizes the human part of medicine, the human part of health, disease, and healing, and caring for and treating patients. It's an interdisciplinary approach. That means we don't rely on one specific discipline to better understand what it means to be sick or what it means to move through the healthcare system, but rather we rely on an interdisciplinary humanities-based approach. So the history of medicine is very, very important to what we're doing right now, right? Literature in medicine, that's what we're going to focus on today. Bioethics, medical ethics, right? So medicine and healthcare are full of ethical issues for which there often is no clear answer or resolution. How do we go about thinking about those issues, right? So history, literature, and bioethics are sort of the three core disciplines that make up medical humanities, but we certainly don't want to neglect some of the others, and the social sciences as well. So medical sociology, medical anthropology, religious studies, et cetera, et cetera. We're housed in the School of Liberal Arts, just south a bit of here, and offer courses to undergraduates, graduates, and nursing students and medical students and others at this point. So in a nutshell, that's medical humanities. What I like about this depiction here and why I chose this image is that it seems to be representative of many of those things I just described, right? Human nature, literature, ethics, history, right? And sort of the human form. We might think of that in this room as anatomy, right? And how that works, physiology. I wish we could spend an hour just talking about this picture, but we don't have that kind of time today. Okay, so moving on to the second objective, we need to think about why literature. Why is literature important not only to medical humanities, but also to, or included in that, is the study of medicine and nursing, right? Becoming healthcare professionals. There tends to be a real focus on science, education. This is, in fact, essential, right? We wouldn't want it to be any other way. However, it might be the case, and I'm a firm believer, right? It might be the case that a study of literature is also essential to becoming a responsible healthcare professional, right? Caring for patients at their most vulnerable. Okay, so we're going to talk about this. Here you see the title page of the first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818. I will be referring to and citing from the 1818 edition today. I am attracted to the first editions of most things. So there is a later edition that is also of value, but today we'll be focusing on the 1818 edition. What can literature do? Very generally speaking, engaging with literature, and by literature I mean essays, novels, biographies, memoirs, poetry, right? Dare I say it, poetry. We engage with these kinds of things to become, well, better people, but to become more prepared to meet strangers, in a nutshell, right? So by engaging with something like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I expand what some call a moral imagination, which means that I think of it as a muscle inside of my brain. It's not really there, but it's strengthened as I engage in something like Frankenstein, or here she quotes from Milton's Paradise Lost on the title page, right? A William Carlos Williams poem, Shakespeare, a sonnet of John Donne's, you name it, right? But we engage with this literature and we think about it and we imagine ourselves as a character within the story or the essay or the poem or whatever it is. And we imagine how we would respond to whatever's happening in the story, right? You all do this as you're reading, whether you're aware of it or not, right? This is what you're doing. And by doing that, we're strengthening this invisible muscle called moral imagination. That better prepares us to meet strangers. So to meet strangers out as we're standing waiting for the people mover that's not running today, or, right, meeting a patient from somewhere very different than where we come from, right? Maybe it's just the other side of Indianapolis. Maybe it's the other side of the world, right? But by engaging in literature, and literature that may have nothing to do with who this stranger is, we've better prepared ourselves to meet them somewhere, right? Maybe not in the middle, but somewhere where we can identify with one another and move forward more productively, right? That literature has the ability to do that. Absolutely. I just spent a significant number of hours with some fourth-year medical students. Trust me when I say significant. You know, we spent this significant number of hours doing this. That's all we were doing. We were reading literature, and we were thinking about it like this. And then we would read more, and then we, you know, when a medical student gets to the fourth year, he or she is ready, for one thing, to be done, right? But also has usually spent the prior 4 years not reading this kind of literature, right? That's a general rule. It's not the case all the time. And so they come to this month sort of hesitant. I would say that's being kind, right? Hesitant. You want me to read a poem? What? And by the end of this month, I will tell you that two of the students said to me on the way out on the last day, one said, I don't understand why this isn't required of all medical students, of everyone who's going to be a doctor. Why don't all medical students have to engage with the literature like this? I thought that was interesting, right? And the second one said, I don't attribute this to me, I attribute it to people like Mary Shelley, right? This is the most valuable experience I've had in my 4 years of medical school, right? You know, this is a lecture honoring Dr. Gaffney, who's here, and she spent some time that month, so it's probably a tribute to her as well, right? Why this was the best experience that I've had in my 4 years of medical school, right? So there's some value. I think we can agree on that. There's some value to spending some time with great literature. Fiction or nonfiction, doesn't matter, right? Doesn't matter a bit. All right, moving on, Emily. All right, so we have to understand, before we go any further, this is not Frankenstein, right? Yeah, okay. So, you know, it's a common misperception. This is not Frankenstein, right? This is who Frankenstein created, right? He put this person, this thing, this being, the jury's still out, you decide what you want to call it. Together, he built this being, right? Frankenstein is the scientist, right? He is the man who had this idea and gave it life, all right? So I'm sure you are aware of that. I just wanted to clarify as we move forward because it might be confusing if we don't remind ourselves of that. Okay, so generally speaking, we can think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as just a kind of spooky, foggy, mysterious, really super cool ghost story, you know, that was written 200 years ago as sort of a bet, right? Who can write the scariest story? Mary Shelley won, right? Lord Byron and Percy Shelley were in on that as well. They did not win. Or we could think of Shelley's Frankenstein as sort of a cautionary tale a lesson in how to be a good person in general, but also how to provide good quality care to people who are sick. And so while I've read this many times, I read it this most recent time through this lens, thinking, how does this story speak to us as healthcare professionals? Right? What can we learn? So that's what we're going to move through. Not 200 lessons, but 10 today. Okay. All right. So the first one I think that Mary Shelley would want to, that might want to warn us about is this move toward exploring our own curiosity, pursuing knowledge, and the risk of paying too little attention to other things, right? So pursuing curiosity for something like curiosity's sake, just to see where we can go, what we can find, without considering the implications, the consequences, the other factors that may be involved, right? As we move through, I'm also going to introduce you to some of the characters. So here in this picture, we have Frankenstein, the scientist, right? He's measuring, he's trying to come up with the perfect formula, right, to put this being together. And then, of course, you see the shadow of the creature looming there over him, right? As he was working through and doing the calculations and trying to breathe life into the inanimate, he should have been paying attention to what was looming around him, right? The story of Frankenstein is told actually from the perspective of Walton, who is an explorer heading north. He's got a ship and a crew, and he wants to go where no man has gone before, right? He's going where it's cold and it's dark most of the time, it's lonely, and it's extremely dangerous, okay? And as he's about to embark on this adventure, he's writing letters to his sister back in England, right? Because that's what you used to do, write letters and mail them. What a romantic idea. And so he's sending these letters, and in the letters, he's talking about not only his experience and his preparations for his journey, but very soon in the story, he meets Victor Frankenstein, okay? But right before that, he says, I shall satiate my ardent curiosity with the sights of a part of the world never before visited, and may tread a land never before imprinted by the foot of man. These are my enticements, and they are sufficient to conquer all fear of danger or death, and to induce me to commence this laborious voyage with the joy a child feels when he embarks in a little boat with his holiday mates on an expedition of discovery up his native river. I feel my heart glow with an enthusiasm which elevates me to heaven, for nothing contributes so much to tranquilize the mind as a steady purpose, a point on which the soul may fix its intellectual eye. He continues, 6 years have passed since I resolved on my present undertaking. 6 years he's devoted, right? Does that sound familiar for those of you who have gone through, let's say, medical school or nursing school, right? You devote a significant amount of your life to this endeavor. I can even now remember the hour from which I dedicated myself to this great enterprise. I commenced by inuring my body to hardship, right? You recall this. I voluntarily endured cold, famine, thirst, and want of sleep. I often worked harder than the common sailors during the day and devoted my nights to study. Do I not deserve to accomplish some great purpose? Again, I'm reminded of the hours I spent with these fourth-year medical students and the way they recalled their time in training and how they spent all day, every day in class, and then seemingly all night, every night, awake studying. One student wrote a great poem about the Dr. Pepper and Cliff Bar, wrappings and cans that would litter and accumulate on his floor as he would study all night long, right? And all of this is good, right? It's moving toward a goal, a worthy goal, but perhaps not at the expense of a lot of other things, right? Keeping in mind what it is you're truly working for and toward, right? Frankenstein, who shortly thereafter comes on the scene, right? He and Walton meet on the ship, and Frankenstein warns him, "You seek for knowledge and wisdom as I once did, and I ardently hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you as mine has been." Right? So Frankenstein is talking to Walton after he's been through everything he's been through with his creation. And he's realized, I pursued my curiosity and my thirst for knowledge at the expense of almost literally everything else. Do not do as I did. Right? So he's trying to warn Walton here. Tread carefully, right? Move forward with caution. All right, another lesson that we can get from Shelley here is something about grief. So when we talk about grief, in generally in a classroom setting, whether it be with undergraduates or nursing students or medical students, there's usually a lot of apprehension. We don't like to talk about it. It's upsetting. It's uncomfortable. We don't understand it. We're not sure if we're doing it right. Are we allowed to be grieving? Is this what it should look like? And there's a passage. This is the only time that I will actually open the book and read from the book, although I think it's important to do that occasionally. There's a passage that I think so perfectly and eloquently gets at the impossibility and inevitability of grief. And I think that we should remember as caregivers, right, just that, the impossibility and the inevitability of grief. She died. This is Frankenstein talking about the death of his mother when he was younger, before he embarked on his studies and his inventions. She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those whose dearest ties are rent by that most irreparable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul, and the despair that is exhibited on the countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she, whom we saw every day, and whose very existence appeared a part of our own, can have departed forever, that the brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. These are the reflections of the first days, but when the lapse of time proves the reality of the evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. Yet from whom has not that rude hand rent away some dear connection, and why should I describe a sorrow which all have felt and must feel? The time at length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity, and the smile that plays upon the lips, although it may be deemed a sacrilege, is not banished. My mother was dead, but we had still duties which we ought to perform. We must continue our course with the rest and learn to think ourselves fortunate whilst one remains whom the spoiler has not seized, right? So reminding ourselves, especially I think as clinicians, that while we may unfortunately confront death frequently due to the nature of our job, for the individual experiencing death, it is a unique, singular experience, right? And one that doesn't make any sense. And so I think, Shelley might be encouraged to know that we are at least thinking about our role in the grieving process, right? Not that we can remedy it or fix it, but rather that we can remember that it exists and we can be present. We can be there. Pay attention. Okay, so the pursuit of fame and glory. It could be argued that Frankenstein himself was in pursuit of some kind of fame and glory. He says, "My dreams were therefore undisturbed by reality," right? They were dreams. "And I entered with the greatest diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. But the latter obtained my most undivided attention. Wealth was an inferior object. But what glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death?" Right? These are arguably worthy pursuits, right? To banish disease from the human frame. But I think Shelley wants us to consider why it is we're working toward this, right? What are we motivated by? If it's fame and glory, tenure, right? Publication in a top journal, promotion, something like that, right? A big grant. That's okay, but we need to be really aware, right, of why we're doing what we're doing, what it is that's pushing us forward, right? Frankenstein was interested in doing this because nobody else had done it before. Wow, right? We're going to bring life, make life, right? We're going to collect all of these parts, put them together just right, spend years and years all alone in a laboratory, and life. I will have done what no one's done before, and that came at great cost, right? So we must consider why we're doing what we're doing. Okay, another lesson. Tunnel vision, right? What do we mean by tunnel vision? Well, when we're looking at one aspect of whatever it is we're doing, and we're focusing in on that one aspect, again, at the expense of all else, right? "Go retrieve me a brain, Igor," right, says Frankenstein, because we are building a live being. And Igor goes and grabs the brain from Abby Normal, right? An abnormal brain. Perhaps this is a deviation from the text. Okay, that's Hollywood. Nevertheless, I think the point is there. "The more fully I entered into the science," Frankenstein remarks, "the more exclusively I pursued it for its own sake. That application, which at first had been a matter of duty and resolution, now became so ardent and eager that the stars often disappeared in the light of morning whilst I was yet engaged in my laboratory. 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva," right, where his family was, "but was engaged heart and soul in the pursuit of some discoveries which I hope to make. None but those who have experienced them can conceive of the enticements of science. In a scientific pursuit, there is continual food for discovery and wonder," right? Which is absolutely true. But there must be something else, right? You must expand your field of vision to include something else. From my perspective, that might be something from the humanities, right? It might be a great novel written 200 years ago. Something else to help shape your perspective, your goals, your outcomes, right? Frankenstein's most dear friend's name was Henry Clerval. He was different. He had a different way of thinking than Frankenstein, right? Frankenstein was devoted to science, figuring out the answers, making new discoveries, right? Henry, on the other hand, wasn't really interested in that. He was no natural philosopher. His imagination was too vivid for the minutiae of science. Languages were his principal study. Study, said Frankenstein, had before secluded me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures and rendered me unsocial, but Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature and the cheerful faces of children, right? Again, expanding your view to include something other than, in this case, just the mechanics, just the pursuit of science. What else needs to be included in that field to make it more whole? This one's my favorite. If you know me, you know that. Empathy. I don't know at all if this picture really represents empathy, but I like it because they stop and look at one another, right? By the light of the fire. And if you're familiar with the story, that doesn't happen very often, right? But at this moment, Frankenstein and his creation meet. They stop and they pause, right? And there's room there in that pause, and we catch glimpses of it, that something might happen that looks a little bit like empathy. What is empathy? Right? It's me trying to understand a little bit about who you are, where you come from, what you might be experiencing, right? True, pure empathy, I think we can agree, is largely out of reach, but the effort toward empathy is what is really, really important, especially, I think, when we're caring for people who are very sick, right? It doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't take a lot of resources. In fact, I'm not sure it takes any resources. Empathy, the attempt to understand somebody else. Really, that's all there is to it. Yeah? If nothing else, this story teaches us the value of empathy. All right? Because it may be very easy to empathize. You know, my husband's here. He's never been to a talk before that I've given. I can empathize with him because, you know, I know him pretty well. I don't know many of you at all. And I certainly don't know my students who sit in the, you know, in my classroom the first semester of their freshman year. And you don't know all of the patients who are in your care, right? We can't expect to. But if I can try to understand a little bit about where you're coming from, then we've made some progress. Okay, so now enters the creation. He is nameless. He is he, but he is nameless in the story. It drives my students crazy because the creation, the being, the monster, the demon, right? Again, it's up to you how you'll refer to him. I'm going to refer to him as the creation. He's alone. And he's wandering the forests and the mountains, trying to figure out what it means to exist and have no one, right? So his creator, Frankenstein, abandoned him immediately, right? The creation comes to life, right? You know that it's alive, yeah. That's Hollywood as well, but. And Frankenstein sees his creation, and he's green, and his eyes are milky, and his veins are popping, and he flees in terror. He is horrified, petrified, fearful of his life. Okay, so then you have this being, huge, you know, bigger than everyone else that he's seeing, not necessarily attractive, who is suddenly in this world without language, without support, without love, without food. I mean, all of the things that we need, right? He does not have these things. So he's wandering around trying to figure out, who am I? He literally says that. Who am I? What am I? How do I eat? How do I stay warm, right? He's able to feel these things like we are able to feel these things. In fact, his senses are heightened, right? Because of the way he was constructed. So colds feel really cold to him. Fear feels really scary. But kindness feels really, really good to the creation. Okay, so fast forward, he's found himself a little hut, just a very tiny wood hut. And he can see through the slats in the wood, and he's observing a family who lives on their own. They have a little garden, and it's a brother and a sister and an elderly father. And he observes them over days, weeks, and months, trying to learn what it means to be alive and to exist, also trying to figure out a way to confront them, right? He's had no luck up to this point confronting anyone, right? As soon as he is seen, people flee, much like Frankenstein did. Okay, so here he is. He's in his hut, and he's observing this family as they tend to the garden and as they sweep their floors and as they sit and strum the guitar at night and this kind of thing. Actually, I can't remember if it was a guitar. I think it was. Anyway, and he says, and all of a sudden, after observing them for quite some time, a new female joins the group. And he can't understand why she's there, what's going on, but he pays very close attention and tries to figure it out. So that's who he's referring to in this passage. I soon perceived that although the stranger, right, the new female, uttered articulate sounds and appeared to have a language of her own, she was neither understood by or herself understood the cottagers. They made many signs which I did not comprehend. Presently I found, by the frequent recurrence of one sound which the stranger repeated after them, that she was endeavoring to learn their language, and the idea instantly occurred to me that I should make use of the same instructions to the same end, right? So quite literally, he's trying to learn their language, right? Here he has a teaching situation. He can observe and he can learn as she is, right? But also, he's attempting to learn their language, right? These are the strangers. He's used to being the stranger. But these are strangers. He wants to make a connection. He wants to develop a relationship. He really just wants to feel wanted, right? But he's going to attempt that by learning their language, understanding who they are, where they come from, right? What their existence is like. He continues, and what was I? Of my creation and creator, I was absolutely ignorant. But I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property, right? What do I have to offer? I was, besides, endowed with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. When I look around, I saw and heard none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? Some of us might feel like that sometimes, or we may know someone who feels like that sometimes, right? Or especially somebody who comes in and who is very sick or is, in some kind of condition that seems to them at least unfavorable. How will, worrying about how will people respond to me? Will I be judged for this decision that I made? Will I be judged because I can't afford this kind of medication, or because I can't get a ride to my next doctor's appointment, or I can't take off another afternoon from work, or I'll lose my job? How are they going to feel about me? Will all men flee and disown me? Right? I think this is something really, really important from this 200-year-old story that we can absolutely apply today as we meet people just on the street, but also as we're taking care of people from lots and lots of different spaces and places and families and we can remember it as we approach them, as we tend to them, as we try to improve their conditions and decrease their suffering. Those who come to us and feel this way, what are our responsibilities to them? He continues, when I contemplated the virtues of the cottagers, their amiable and benevolent dispositions, I persuaded myself that when they should become acquainted with my admiration of their virtues, they would compassionate me and overlook my personal deformity. Could they turn from their door one, however monstrous, who solicited their compassion and friendship? We would hope not, right? In fact, they did. They absolutely did. Here he had spent so long worrying about it, admiring them, trying to understand them, trying to figure out how to approach them in a way that would not frighten them, would not turn them away. Yet it failed, right? The judgment was there, the fear was there, and they did turn him from their door. In fact, they ran. He was left at their door, right? They ran the other way. The hut was burned down, and that was the end of that. Hope I'm not spoiling anything. If you haven't yet read the story, you should. All right, fine. And then moving on. We've got to move on. To read, right? To read these stories, to spend time, engage, like I discussed before, with interesting literature. Shelley would certainly be a proponent of that, but so would Frankenstein, I think, and the creation, right? So as he's in this hut trying to figure out what it means to exist, he stumbles upon a bundle of books, right? I joke with my students that wouldn't that be great if you just stumble upon a bundle of books, monthly maybe we could do that. We could create a mail order thing. And he says, I can hardly describe to you the effect of these books. They produced in me an infinity of new images and feelings that sometimes raised me to ecstasy. As I read, however, I applied much personally to my own feelings and condition. I found myself similar, yet at the same time strangely unlike the beings concerning whom I read and to whose conversation I was a listener. I learned from Werthe's imagination's despondency and gloom. Plutarch taught me high thoughts. He elevated me above the wretched sphere of my own reflections to admire and love the heroes of past ages. Many things I read surpassed my understanding and experience, right? The being, Frankenstein's monster, right, gets that there's something that can be found within books that can teach us a lot about existing in the world and relating to the other, right? And maybe even understanding the other. Another lesson from Shelley's tale is to appreciate and value the natural, literally, like nature, as things change. Watching, the blooms of spring, and then watching them turn green and full in the summer and then slowly die away in the fall and winter, right? We're very well aware of that. But to notice those things, right? Frankenstein spent all of his time inside in a lab devoted to his task and missed all of this sort of miraculous change occurring outside, and it did something to him. Right? And so there's something to that. Again, back to my medical students who are just fresh on my brain. They said things like, at the end of the day, what keeps me together is to go outside and go on a run and breathe in something fresh. She really said that, right? To take a walk through the woods. I mean, it sounds kind of cliche, but there's really something to it. And when Frankenstein was feeling, such despair after what he had done and the consequences of his actions, he was met again with his dear friend Henry. And Henry pointed out the shifting colors of the landscape and the appearances of the sky and cried, "This is what it is to live. Now I enjoy existence," right? This is what it is to live, to witness that is natural instead of, artificial, right? Mechanical, conjured together, right? And to learn from mistakes, right? So in the story, again, this is a big spoiler alert, there's no bride of Frankenstein, right? There's no bride, there's no companion. There almost was a companion, but there wasn't. If you're interested in a bride of Frankenstein, there's plenty of movies and tales that you can access. But Frankenstein, to give him some credit, I don't give him a lot of credit, but to give him some credit, he says, during my first experiment, a kind of enthusiastic frenzy had blinded me to the horror of my employment. My mind was intently fixed on the sequel of my labor, and my eyes were shut to the horror of my proceedings. But now I went to it in cold blood, and my heart often sickened at the work of my hands. And he abandons the project altogether, eventually, right? But here we have an example of making one mistake. And we don't have time today, but we could argue whether the mistake was actually the creation or his response to the creation, right? That's a whole nother talk. Nevertheless, it didn't work out well, right? It didn't work out well. Many people died. And he finds himself creating a second one, but he stops. There's something to that, right? I mean, it's very obvious. We learned this from the time we were young, to learn from our mistakes, not to make the same mistake twice, right? So maybe we can forgive him a little bit for the first, because it did eventually lead him to abandon the project the second time. And of course, compassion, along with empathy. They're different, empathy and compassion. But I think that this book reminds us the importance of everyday compassion, right? At the end of the story, the creature who is pursuing and has been pursued by his creator, Frankenstein, is trying to plead with Walton. Okay, remember Walton the explorer. And he says that Walton, who has been charged by Frankenstein to kill the creation, okay, he says, "Let your compassion be moved and do not disdain me. Listen to my talk. When you have heard that, abandon me or commiserate me, as you shall judge that I deserve. But hear me," right? After you've listened, and after I've had the opportunity to tell my side of the story, to tell my tale, where I come from, why I believe what I believe, right? Why I've done what I've done. After I've had the opportunity to tell you that, then you decide, right? Abandon me or not. But hear me first. This is something I think we should all be reminded of on a regular basis. Hear me first. Let people tell the story, right? If we presume to know the story upon first meeting, we are mistaken, right? And that could lead to not ideal care. Absolutely, right? Absolutely. But hear me. And Walton considers this plea. And he says, his voice seemed suffocated, and my first impulses, which had suggested to me the duty of obeying the dying request of my friend, right, to destroy his enemy, were now suspended by a mixture of curiosity and compassion, right? So just hearing that little bit from this grotesque, enormous stranger who suddenly appeared through the window on this ship in the middle of nowhere, right? And whose entire tale of horror you've just heard from somebody you befriended, again, in the middle of nowhere, just listening to him for that moment has opened up his mind, right? and he is now moved, at least, by something like compassion and curiosity. Tell me more, right? Maybe I didn't get the whole story. Maybe there are pieces, right, that were left out, important pieces that were left out, right? In healthcare, we have to do this not only to relate better with our patients and strangers, those we're caring for or being cared for by, but also so that we can make responsible decisions, right? I mean, many times we are forced to make a decision that just doesn't seem ideal. And if we're making those decisions in haste, right, without getting as much of the story as we can, then we may not be making the most responsible decisions. And then you'll be happy to know this is the last one. That we remember people, that we notice people, that we don't abandon people, okay? Frankenstein abandoned his family. They were always there waiting for him. But he abandoned his family, he abandoned his friends, and he abandoned, perhaps most importantly, right, his creation, the being to whom he gave life. As Walton's wrapping up the story, he says, "Do you dream?" said the demon. Okay, Frankenstein referred to him as the demon. "Do you think that I was then dead to agony and remorse? My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of the change without torture, such as you cannot even imagine." My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy. Another good reminder, I think, right? As we meet people, as we're caring for people with whom we may not agree at all, we may dislike, we may find offensive, right? I think this is really interesting. My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy. Do you not think that I don't feel, experience, endure pain? And then wise words from Frankenstein at the very end. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful, that is to say, not befitting the human mind. So again, to broaden our view, right? Rely on multiple perspectives. Science and literature, science and history, philosophy and medicine. All of these things together would be, really great. So as not to focus too much on one thing and lose sight of everything else that actually matters and contributes to whatever it is you're doing, whatever pursuit, whatever goal, whatever end game, right? Why are you doing what you're doing? Are you prepared to respond appropriately, right? My creation didn't turn out as I expected. He's scary looking. Right? I'm out of here. Somebody else can deal with it. That didn't go so well for Victor Frankenstein, right? And to remember that at the heart of everything are people, right? People who need companionship and support and sometimes just to be heard. All right, that's it. Thank you. Thank you to Mary Shelley. This is Mary Shelley, her masterpiece that just had a birthday. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. That was an excellent talk.
Yeah, thanks.
I really appreciate it. You kind of right at the end here give that sense of wanting providers to be able to reach into lots of different domains. And I definitely see some of the physicians that I envy are really healthy because of some sort of creative outlook or outlet that that I think does that. And I wonder if you have advice for providers or nurses or physicians or whoever about how to kind of grow that in oneself, especially when most of our rigor and training has not focused on that at all. So if you had something to give us as a suggestion, I'd appreciate it.
That's a great question. Thanks. That's kind of the $1,000,000 question, right? That we grapple with all the time. So a couple of responses, and I hope I get at what you're asking. We have created on a large scale a system that doesn't allow, right? It doesn't make it easy anyway to engage in this kind of creative or interdisciplinary exploration. So I think that first we need to think about changing that a bit, right? The way that we train, right? Healthcare professionals. But on a more personal level, I think of the people that I know who do engage in this kind of thing. I mean, I have many colleagues in medicine specifically who read these kinds of stories on a regular basis and just make it an absolute point to do that, right? I think it was William Osler who said, of course it was, right? Didn't he say everything? But said something like, every medical student should spend at least 20 minutes every night before bed reading something other than medicine, right? Engaging in a novel or something like that. And it does seem like, we don't have the time to do that. We don't have the time to do that. But if you think about 20 minutes as you fall asleep at night, right? And that does something to you that I think is beneficial. And then I know other, colleagues who, spend their time glass blowing, and that takes a bit more time and resources, but it's really, really interesting. And so I think, and I ask the fourth year students, I always say, okay, what advice can I take back to my undergraduate students who are about to go into medicine? And they always say for them to find this creative outlet and stick with it. Make sure if it's reading that they like, that they continue reading. If it's writing poetry, that they continue doing that, right? If it's, whatever it is, that they maintain that. But it's very difficult to do, of course, because of the rigor required of health professions programs and then, the testing and the ranking and I've got to match, right? And I don't match necessarily based on how many novels I read, right? I match based on, So yeah, it's a good question. But I think trying to get that into the curriculum and making it more of a priority system-wide is really important. And we're working on it. Yeah, good. Yeah. Anything else? If ever you want to talk about books, you can come find us over in Kavanaugh Hall, right? I have a Frankenstein scarf on. Yeah, my colleague Jane Hartsock gave it to me. I told her I'd wear it for this talk. So anyway, I'm a fan.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you.
Beckman. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.